And there are certain qualities that I take from Lincoln and I take from Roosevelt that are still very, very true today. I'm going to give them in advance, and I'm going to go over this a little more in detail. But be decisive initially. Fort Sumter, you know, the whole cabinet. Lincoln had just come in, had been there a week, and there was big old General Scott. He was 300 pounds, but he won the victory of the Mexican War. And don't reinforce Sumter, don't provoke him. Whole cabinet, don't reinforce. He listened. He says, we reinforced Sumter. He saved the Union. But that wasn't all he did. Then he called with 75,000 volunteers. Then he mobilized the railroads. He was a railroad lawyer. Very quickly, he was moving in to be a smart strategist. He acted decisively, and Roosevelt left the fleet exposed at Pearl Harbor, but then he moved after that. That's number one, being decisive. And George W. Bush at 9/11 was decisive. He was not on Katrina, but he was exemplary those first 2 weeks in everything he did. Second, you've got to be a unifier. You've got to bring the country together. George W. Bush had the nation could make you weep, and the world together for 2 months. Then we blew it. We blew it. Unifier, persuader. You know, you can do a lot in persuading people. You can't command people, but you can persuade. You've got to be a strategist. You've got to know ways and means and timing. And then you've got to mobilize the whole country. And then you've got to have a vision. Because as you deal with peril, you've got to have promise. You've got to have a vision of tomorrow, a better world. FDR in his time called it a mighty coalition of civilized nations that he wanted to go on after the war. So those are the qualities. And as I say, the first, in being decisive, I've already talked about the way he handled himself initially, and I've already said that Roosevelt making the mistakes at Pearl Harbor, then after that he mobilized the nation. And second, you've got to build unity and you've got to have timing. Now Lincoln had a divided North. You had the Copperheads, you had the Democrats that were willing to fight to save the Union, but not against slavery. And then you had the border states that could go either way. And this man that had gone into politics because his hatred of slavery. By the way, at that point, he didn't feel the black man was his equal. It was not until he got these 180,000 troops that fought so magnificently that he said, more than my equal. There was a maturation to reach that point, but he knew slavery was wrong. So when he says, no, we can't move for abolition, it's got to be preserving the Union, William Lloyd Garrison and others created him. Duplicitous. He had to do that, and then after the half-assed victory at Antietam, he made it a great victory in 1862, and he moved to complete the Second American Revolution in moving towards the following January in abolition. Not completed in the Voting Rights Act, the second. Women didn't get the right to vote until 1925. So the second revolution wasn't completed, but we started on what the founding fathers couldn't do, and they knew it in their guilt. It was timing. Roosevelt, before the war, knew that this partisan New Dealer, and I came from an East Tennessee Republican bank. We had our financial crisis, and they closed the biggest bank in Chattanooga. My mother's family, larger family, owned half of it, and they said, well, it's a Republican bank, that's why he did it. I don't think it was true, but that's what I was told. But Senator Bill Brock told me, and I told him that story the other day, he's Republican, but the first Senator Brock was Democratic. He said, Dave, we had a Democratic bank and closed that too. I said, well, I'm glad to know that. And you know, as I studied my graduate work, Abraham studied Franklin Roosevelt, what a man he was. This partisan New Dealer did the Soak the Rich speech of 1935, and in 1938, he said to Harry Hopkins, the intellectual author of the New Deal, I've been Dr. New Deal. Harry, Hitler's coming, that's over. I'm Dr. Win the War. To hell with the New Deal, I'm your man on the war. And he died as his traveling diplomat. What did he do? He goes out, he gets these two outstanding Republicans, not just because they were Republicans, but Stimson, who'd been Hoover's very able Secretary of State, puts them in the cabinet, Secretary of the Navy, same thing as a political opponent. He goes out, and 2 years later gets Wendell Willkie. Sending you my envoy, talk to Churchill. I suggested to this administration, after 9/11, they send Al Gore to Europe. They would have said he didn't know who won the election. You know, we've forgotten to think that way. We've forgotten where Roosevelt moved from partisanship to putting his country first, and built great power in doing it. And then third, we move to communicating the hearts and minds. Lincoln, in his second inaugural, the Gettysburg Address, and he wrote letters that he leaked to the press so they'd get in the newspapers. FDR, his fireside chats and bringing Elmer Davis in. And he knew how to communicate to people. You know, it's interesting that General Eisenhower, President Eisenhower, established the United States Information Agency. He said, Eisenhower said, the hearts and minds, the ideas are more important than armies in ending the Cold War. We should never abolish USIA, by the way. And look at all of the problems we've got in our international communications. And then fourth is what I've said, it's command of strategy. Ends and means and timing. You know, I'll be very even-handed in this statement, because Woodrow Wilson, a brilliant head of Princeton University, a brilliant scholar, he wanted to make the world safe for democracy. He didn't have the ways and means of getting there. To begin with, he didn't build coalitions on Capitol Hill to support him. He didn't take any Republicans with him to the negotiations. And then he went to the country and tried to bypass. So the League of Nations, which maybe could have stopped Hitler, never came into being.